Welcome to Getting Personal with Plant Medicine. I'm your host, Diana Crash, and today I am joined by Jennifer Chesick. Did I say that right?
You did, yes. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So let's just get right into it and talk about what led to you writing the Psilocybin Handbook for Women.
Yeah, so I can't actually take credit for the idea. It was the idea of my publisher, but I felt like I was really the right person to do it because I have such a passion for women's health. I've had many health problems myself throughout my life. And so I really dug into women's health and studied it quite a bit, written about it as a journalist. And I've also been writing about psychedelics as a journalist. So it seemed like a good fit to merge the two, especially when I started to dig into the research. So it turns out that in some cases, more women are using some psychedelics more frequently than men are, which came as a bit of a surprise. And then when I dug a little deeper, it wasn't that surprising. And the reason for that is because there's actually a difference in the way that men and women tend to use psychedelics. So again, this is overgeneralization from a survey. It's called the Global Drug Survey of 2020. But what the survey found was that men tend to use psychedelics a little bit more recreationally. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's, again, an overgeneralization. But women are using psychedelics to self-treat. So they're self-treating for conditions like PTSD, trauma, anxiety. So lots of mental health conditions, but also physical health conditions such as chronic pain, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, other things like that. Just, any pain condition or condition that they're not getting adequate treatment for in the mainstream medical system. And whenever I talk about the mainstream medical system, and I want to say that I'm not against the mainstream medical system. I appreciate it. I'm
But
a
it's so
science and medical
broken,
journalist. It's broken. It's broken. Yes. So yeah, so that's been a big problem. And I always like to share this timeline because I know we're going to get into a talk a little bit about sexual health a bit. So this timeline is related to that, and then we can dig into some of the ways that psilocybin may be able to help. But so women were largely excluded from early stage clinical trials until the 1990s. It was like the early 1990s. Now we share this because I like to explain, why are we so behind in women's health? Why is it such a struggle for us? So it turns out that so this timeline gets people fired up
It did when I
in
read it in
19
your book. I was like,
yeah,
oh,
thank
I know
you.
about this, but
Yes,
it's like every
you
time
know,
I just get like ragey again.
yes, this makes me rageful too. And I'm not normally a rageful person, but
Yeah.
in 1998, men got a drug for male sexual dysfunction. And everyone knows what that is. It's Viagra, right? Household name. At that point in time, the medical community, let alone anyone that a woman might have been sleeping with, didn't have a complete picture of what the clitoris looks like. There's all this internal structure to the clitoris. And science didn't discover that until 2005 when a female urologist, of course, did some research with MRI and determined this. And then it wasn't until 2015 that women got a drug for female sexual dysfunction. So that's a 17-year gap from when men got a drug for a condition to when women got a drug for the exact same condition. Now, of course, sexual dysfunction, affects the male body differently than the female body, but it's still, in a nutshell, the same condition. And when we think about the statistics of female sexual dysfunction, it's pretty alarming that there wasn't a drug for us until 2015. So it's women of reproductive age, or people assigned female at birth of reproductive age, they have usually about a 40 to 45% prevalence of female sexual dysfunction. And then it increases exponentially by the time that people are in menopause. So then it goes up to about 80 to 85% of people in menopause have some type of female sexual dysfunction. So it's a pretty alarming thing to think about with the mainstream medical system.
And it is alarming. And I feel like we don't put enough emphasis on that alarm because so many of us, individuals who were assigned female at birth, we don't know these things because it's just like commonly accepted to just say, okay, well, that's part of whatever. It's part of menopause. It's part of perimenopause. It's part of having this condition or that condition. And you just chalk it up to that. And you don't really look into it anymore because it's so status quo, right? Like it's just what we're just become accustomed to. And so I'm so happy that you pointed that out. That was fantastic chapter. They're all
Thank
great,
you.
but so let's talk about some of the misconceptions that you aim to address with this book, because I know there are quite a
Yeah.
few. I mean, you just spoke about one, but you can expand on that a little more.
Yeah, so some of the misconceptions with psilocybin, I think that are really important to kind of debunk are that, so yes, it's being studied for all of these different things right now, a lot of mental health conditions, some physical health conditions, which is great. But I think I want to point out that it's, even though it's called magic mushrooms, it's not a magic bullet for everything. And I don't want to sell it as that. And then the other thing to consider is that yes, like it has all these beneficial effects that we're learning about, but at the same time, the individual has to do the work as well. So it's not going to solve everything for you unless you do something that's called integration. And even then, it may not solve everything for you, but you're doing the work to make that happen. So integration is, so let's say you do a trip or a macro dose, so like a deeper journey, and you're aiming to work on some type of behavior change, whether that's cutting back on your drinking, anything like that, because psilocybin is being studied for alcohol use disorder. And so if you're wanting to do that, yes, the actual journey may bring you some really incredible insight into what's behind your drinking, why are you turning to drinking in the first place. But then afterwards, you have to do what's called integration to actually implement some of that behavior change. And so integration is the process of learning from your experience. And so it can be done in many different ways, whether that's journaling, that was the method that I chose. But you can also do that with a therapist. There are integration therapists out there, and there are lots of great integration communities. So you can find what are called integration circles, and some of them are in person, some of them are online. And really what an integration circle is just sharing. You're sitting around with people who've also had psychedelic experiences, and you're sharing about your experience and bouncing ideas off each other to sort of learn from your insights. And it's a beautiful process. And integration is something that it's not that you just do it one time and you're done. You continue to integrate your experience for as long as you need to. So, for example, I did a macrodose about a year ago, and I'm still gaining insights from that. And so I'm constantly doing integration related to that.
That's amazing. I love that. I love the fact that people are having a sense of community or finding some type of
Mhm.
community. I think that what I find different about the psychedelic spaces when it comes to the community spaces from, say, cannabis is that there isn't like a judgment about how you consume or why, so much. I feel like there's less judgment. So at least from what I've been able to see. Um,
Of course.
I don't know. That's just my
No,
hot
I
take.
agree. I like it. It's a good hot take.
So, in your opinion, how does the use of psilocybin influence intimacy and connection in relationships?
Yes, that's a great question. So I'll have to dig into a little brain science here. So there's something in our brains called the default mode network, and that is a network of brain regions that work together and they connect and they form our sense of self, our autobiographical information. So like our memories about the past, anytime we're thinking about the future, anytime our mind is sort of wandering, the default mode network is highly active. Well, when we use psilocybin, something happens with the default mode network. And I like to explain it like this, that some parts of it that normally connect will disconnect. And then other parts that normally aren't connected will connect. So it's almost like if you thought about an outlet in your home and you've got all these like different devices plugged into it, and if you were to disconnect all of them and replug them back into different sections of your outlet or whatever, you would have a different neural network going on just temporarily. So this happens during a psilocybin journey, like a macro dose. And part of that, there's something called ego death, and that can sound really scary. This idea of like, oh, I'm going to completely lose my sense of self. And sure, that can happen with an extreme dose, what we call a heroic dose, so
Yeah.
something like above 5 grams. But
uh,
if you're doing a traditional macro dose, you're typically doing about 3.5 grams maybe. And you'll have some elements of ego death that are really beneficial, but you won't completely forget who you are, temporarily or anything like that. But so this term ego death, I know it can sound really scary, so I just always like to explain that. But one of the benefits of ego death can be this concept called oceanic boundlessness. And so oceanic boundlessness is like a Freudian term, and it was coined by Freud and some other guy, and it was a French mystic, and I always forget his name. But anyway, these dudes got together and made up this term, the oceanic boundlessness. But when we have a little bit of ego death or ego dissolution, we stop focusing so much on our inner world or ourselves, and we feel this connection to the world at large. So almost like that we're part of the bigger universe, or that we're connected to everyone that we know and love, that sort of thing. And so that's what I mean by oceanic boundlessness, is this sense of connectivity or deeper sense of intimacy with people. And it was something that I experienced on my journey when I kind of felt like threads of light were connecting me to everyone that I know and love, and I could send love to them and I could feel their love coming back to me. That sounds very abstract, but it was just a concept that's related to that oceanic boundlessness. And it was really profound, because a lot of times we feel like we know we have a support system out there, but to really, really feel it in our bodies is such an amazing thing. And so that happened for me. But in terms of intimacy, so this could potentially foster really good intimate partner communication. And what we know about sexual health and female sexual dysfunction, there are a couple of things that are protective against female sexual dysfunction. One of those is intimate partner communication. The other is having a positive body image, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But facilitating that intimate partner communication comes from that concept of oceanic boundlessness. So this does not mean that you necessarily have to be with your partner and doing psilocybin. You could go off and do your own journey and then come back and feel more connected to your partner, which is a really amazing thing. And that did happen for me. Like, I'm not necessarily grappling with sexual dysfunction or anything like that, but I went off and did my own journey. My husband was not with me. And when I came back, it's not like he had done anything different, but I felt exponentially more connected to him. And that's been a lasting thing. It's not that we were having marital problems, but it was just the growth that I experienced with my marriage. And so that intimate partner communication, as I mentioned, can be protective against sexual dysfunction because, for example, you may have been withholding in the bedroom, or you may have been not voicing what your needs are. And so that could help. If you're able to do that, then that can help transcend some of the sexual dysfunction. So sexual dysfunction can be with the female body, it can be so many different things. It could be pain with intercourse. It could be inability to orgasm. It could be low libido. There are multiple facets of what female sexual dysfunction can be. It's not just a one thing. And then I just wanted to briefly touch on that, on the body image thing. So the other thing that's protective against female sexual dysfunction is having a positive body image. And we know through research now, because psilocybin is being studied for eating disorders, that psilocybin is having some beneficial effects on body image. And that all has to do with some of the things that happen with a default mode network, as I was describing before, but also with something in the brain called the angular gyrus, which can be really rigid in when eating disorders are present or when we have a negative body image. And so we're noticing through research some beneficial effects there. So I really think that psilocybin can help facilitate, maybe help with sexual dysfunction if you're experiencing that. It's not going to necessarily be the only thing that helps, but it's something that's maybe potentially a tool that could work for people. Now, all this is not to say that psilocybin is some sort of like aphrodisiac. It's probably actually not.
I was going to say, I think that sometimes, sorry, I mean to cut you off, but I don't know if it's like, is it dose dependent? That's what I'm wondering when you're saying all of this, because I microdose and I don't necessarily feel that it helps with libido, Right. But I do see what you mean about connection and body image. And I'm just wondering, do you think the macro dose is a better fit for what you're talking about?
I think it could go either way. I think a macro dose is incredibly helpful for really digging deep into some of those things like body image and just showing you that support system that you have, things like that, or working on anything very specific that you're trying to work on. Whereas microdosing, I think, can really support the after the macrodose. If you microdose after that,
Okay.
in whatever protocol you follow, I think that can be really supportive to keep tying you back to your macro dose. To what were your insights? Because you'll continue to get some of those insights while microdosing. So I think that that might be the case. But in terms of like, is this an aphrodisiac? It's probably like you're not going to microdose and be like, ooh, I feel
Yeah.
all like getting busy in the bedroom right now. It's
unless
probably not
unless
going
you're
to do
Dr.
that.
Michelle Ross, right? Because I read.
Well, right, yes, yes. So she's great. That's the neuroscientist that I
Yeah.
interviewed for the book about sexual function. And, so she was great. She
She's
mentioned going
funny.
off and doing a solo journey, exploring yourself, learning what you really love, and then taking that back with your partner. And
Yeah.
I think that was really brilliant advice. Of course, there are classic aphrodisiacs like, cacao or oyster. People mention oysters, and I've never really looked into whether
No.
that's a legit thing.
Yeah.
But again, psilocybin is probably not going to like boost your sex drive. It just might help your sex life through other means.
Oh, absolutely. And I think also using it with other types of plant medicine
Sure.
enhances those effects, right? I mean, at least for
Yeah.
me. So,
Yeah, and she mentioned that too. Like
yeah.
again, combining that with the cacao ceremony or other things like that. So
Yeah, yeah. I've interviewed her several times about different types of plant medicine. So I know that I know she had her own kratom line for a long time, and I've interviewed her for an article about that. And I think kratom can also help, as part of your whole
absolutely.
wellness routine, especially if you're dealing with any type of pain issues. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure, like I said, I think all of these things kind of work together if you are able to figure out what works
Yeah,
when.
absolutely. Right, right. Yes, absolutely.
And so, in that vein, what advice do you have for women who are trying to use this as part of their sexual health wellness routine? I mean, like you just said, it's not a magic bullet, but like if they're just
Yeah.
afraid and they don't know how to start.
Sure. So I think one of the things to remember is that a lot of the stuff that we've learned in the last, in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s that were coming out about psychedelics was incorrect. And what I mean by that is the war on drugs took off. And so before that, there was lots of good research happening and we were getting good information. Then the war on drugs took off with the Nixon administration and continued with the Reagan administration. And there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation put out there, meaning that, people were saying, oh, everyone's doing ecstasy, which is we call it MDMA now, but back then it was ecstasy or
Yeah.
then it was Molly and stuff. And so everyone's on MDMA and they're all going crazy, and that was just not true. And that's not how psychedelics really work. You're
Right.
not going to take mushrooms and then jump off a building. These are things that, I mean, sure, yes,
I was going to say,
extreme
did you hear
circumstances
about the
can
pilot?
happen. Yeah, I know, but like, he had said he had taken mushrooms 24 hours ago or longer. And it's like, well, that's not how this works. It's not still in your system. This didn't lead you to do something stupid.
I know. I was just
So,
like, they were all going to grab onto that. The people that are
of
like, the
course,
prohibitionist
I
propaganda is going to
know.
grab
I
onto
was
that.
like, oh no, stop it. But yeah, so trying to get rid of some of that misinformation. So I always tell people just throw everything out that you've ever learned about psychedelics and start fresh. Start learning about it now.
Yeah.
We've got really great research coming out. The other thing I like to share to take some of the fear out of it is what's actually happening in the brain when you're on psilocybin, because I think it's such an abstract concept of like why would psilocybin help with something like PTSD or other forms of trauma or depression? Why would this even work? Why would taking a mushroom do this? And so I like to explain this. And so scientists have come up with this really great model to describe it. And this was created by Dr. Carl J. Friston and Dr. Carhart Harris. I would like to give credit where credit is due. This isn't it's not my research, but I wrote about it in the book. So this is called the Rebus model. It's which stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. It's kind of a wonky little acronym, but What this means is that if we think back to childhood, our brains were really flexible. We hadn't yet formed opinions about ourselves. We hadn't formed our identity or concepts about how the world around us operates. We developed that over time through adolescence. And then in adulthood, that can become very rigid in many people. In fact, most people, our brains just become super rigid in terms of our identity, in terms of how we believe the world operates. And we can have a lot of negative ideas about ourselves, you know? So, I was teaching a writing workshop last night, so I'll use this example of people who think, oh, I want to write, but I'm not a good writer, right? So if you were trying to change that idea about yourself, that can be so hard because the pathway of thinking about that has become so rigid. And so in when we're on a psychedelic, or I'm sorry, in a normal state of consciousness, again, that's super rigid. And when we can think of our brains in that context is almost like a frozen pond. So researchers developed this beautiful analogy. And so if you were to try to take a new belief, let's say you're saying, hey, I am a good writer. And we think of that belief as almost like a rock, and you try to drop it on a frozen pond, it doesn't do anything. It just goes thunk, and it doesn't gain entry. Nothing happens. And that's because that brain is so rigid then. But if you are on a psychedelic, this is where that relaxed beliefs under psychedelics comes in. That brain then becomes like a thawed pond. So now you have water. Now you take that rock in the form of a new belief that you're trying to get into your brain. You drop it in, it gains entry and causes a ripple effect, right? It can have a lasting, it can be like this lasting uptake of a new belief. So in a normal state of consciousness, it's really just hard to change your mind about stuff. But when we're on a psychedelic, it's much more accessible to us to do that, which is great. And it all comes down to the fact that when we are in a normal state of consciousness, we have this hierarchy of beliefs. So we can think of it almost like a corporate structure. You've got your CEO beliefs at the top. And then if you have the lesser employees at the bottom, and those are like the beliefs that you might want to gain entry into your brain, but the CEO beliefs won't let that happen. They're like, no, we're not going to listen to you. What do you know? Right. And so when we are on a psychedelic, that hierarchy of beliefs kind of goes away. Everyone's equal. And so the new beliefs that we're trying to get in can get in and gain footing and climb to the top and maybe perhaps become the CEO beliefs instead of the ones that are on the bottom of the ladder, right? And so I just think that really helps explain this concept of why do psychedelics work for that. And then the other thing is this beautiful concept called the helioscope effect. And this was created by a researcher named Dr. Gregor Hassler. So a helioscope is an instrument that that scientists use to look at the sun, because you're not supposed to look directly at the sun or you'll burn your eyes. Pro tip there. Pro tip unrelated to psychedelics. But we can think of this same concept happening when we are on a psychedelic in relation to trauma, because in a normal state of consciousness, we avoid looking at our traumas or thinking about our traumas because they're very triggering and they're very disconcerting to us. But when we are on a psychedelic, it's like we have this helioscope instrument and we're able to view our trauma without getting burned or without getting triggered. And I just love that. And then we also are able, the helioscope has a great little lens or filter for looking at the sun in a new way. So we can think of that as the same when we're on a psychedelic. We can view our trauma in a new way and perhaps reprocess it so that it's not so traumatizing when we're back in a normal state of consciousness. So it just has some really beneficial effects for changing our minds about ourselves and then also working on trauma and reprocessing it so it's not as triggering, and sort of resetting that stress response related to our traumas, which is just great. So that helps to take some of the mystery out of it. But so my suggestion, you asked like what suggestions do you have for people if they are interested in exploring this? Certainly recommend reading my book. It's a little shameless self-promotion, because I dig into all of these concepts a little bit more in depth and sort of try to demystify what psychedelics do and things like that. And then there are some great communities out there that are useful and educational. I mean, obviously listening to podcasts can really help if you're finding podcasts on psychedelics and just learning more. But there are some communities like Moms on Mushrooms is really great. So that is MOM, and it's an organization created by Tracy T. She's fabulous. She's been on all the news networks and things like this talking about moms who are doing mushrooms. And she's just trying to destigmatize, reduce the stigma associated with parents doing mushrooms. I think this is brilliant. But she
Mm-hmm.
also has a lot of community programming. So there's like a book club, and there's other educational components to this community that she has. And then the other one I want to mention is the Flourish Academy. And so this is an organization that was created by one of the founders. There used to be a different organization called Sisters in Psychedelics, which I just loved the name. But that switched to the Flourish Academy
Okay.
essentially. But it's an organization that is meant to really help educate people about psychedelics, share resources, create community, provide some educational concepts, and so that those are two that I really highly recommend.
That's amazing. I really am a big fan of the Moms on Mushroom group.
Yeah,
I hope to
absolutely, they're
have her
fabulous.
on. Yeah, that is really cool. I'm really excited to see all of these things pop up. I mean, I know that it's been going on for a long time, but it's like now, it's like when you look for it, you're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Right? There's like mushroom paraphernalia everywhere. Like,
Yeah,
everyone's giving me mushroom earrings, mushroom pillows. But yes,
right.
there's all this information about psychedelics, but mushrooms in general are just hot right
I
now.
know. It's like, and I at first was like, okay, yeah, I like psychedelic mushrooms, sure. But then I started really looking into all of like the functional mushrooms and all of them, like really looking into, I mean, it's like I learned something new every day about mushrooms. It's really
Yes,
exciting. It
it
might sound
is.
cheesy, but it's super exciting. So
No, I agree. And it's not cheesy at all.
So, as society, obviously, we're talking about them being more accepting of mushrooms in general. So, as the attitudes evolve, where do you see the future of psilocybin use for women and non-binary folks, or what is your hope for the future?
Yeah. So there's some really great research coming out now, and it's in continuation about how does psilocybin potentially affect the menstrual cycle. So I'll dive into that because I do see a lot of potential for women or people assigned female at birth who have a menstrual cycle or who are even in menopause to manage different symptoms or conditions that they have. So again, premenstrual dysphoric disorder or polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, maybe even infertility. So I'll share some of that research and then you can see what I'm talking about. So Johns Hopkins University, they have a psychedelic center and they've done some really great research. The research was put out by Dr. Natalie Gukassian and Dr. Sasha Kana-Ryan. Again, just giving credit where credit is due, especially to female scientists. So they did some case studies and on what is happening with the menstrual cycle for women who've used a psychedelic, and they did focus on psilocybin a bit. And what they're finding is that if there's potential, and again, we need more research on this. This isn't clinical trials; it's just case studies at this point. But what they're finding is that there is potential that psilocybin may make a menstrual cycle come early. So meaning that you might get your period a little earlier than you thought or it may bring back a menstrual cycle after a time of where we've had an absence of that. And I'm not talking about in menopause, but I am referring to
Birth
so
control.
sometimes, yeah, well, birth control or if you've had a lot of stress in your life or you
Mm-hmm.
lost a lot of weight, that can stop the
Yeah.
menstrual cycle temporarily. So it sounds like psilocybin may be able to bring it back. And then the other thing that people have reported is that they've had a return to a regular menstrual cycle after a time of like irregularity, which can happen for a number of reasons, including several of the conditions that I
I've
just
noticed that as
mentioned.
well. You know what? Sorry to cut you off, but it just like
No, you're
occurred to
fine.
me. Like I have endometriosis, so it's always it's not that it lightens it, but it has made it much more what's the word I'm looking for? Trackable.
Tolerable?
Like I could yeah, well that too.
Untrackable.
I
Okay.
mean, we just did an episode with Leslie Draffin about it. So I went, go back and listen to
Okay.
that and you'll hear more about but it has made it more like every month at the same time is what's the word
Oh,
for that?
great.
Consistent.
So regular, yeah, more
Regular.
consistent or more regular. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have endometriosis too, by the way. So I feel your pain
Yeah,
literally,
endo
right?
sisters. Yep.
Yes, yes, endo warriors. But yeah, so I do see a lot of this potential for some of these conditions, and a lot of people want to know about the mechanism. Like, why would taking magic mushrooms do anything to the menstrual cycle? And this is why it was so important to write a book specifically for the female body. So the menstrual cycle occurs along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So what I mean by that is that your brain is working with your ovaries to kick off hormones, and then when one hormone kicks off, it tells another hormone what to do in this sort of feedback loop. And that's why we have our follicular phase, then we have ovulation, then we have the luteal phase, and then we have our periods. But at the same time, we also have another axis, and that's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that is concerned with our stress response. And so when we are taking psilocybin, that psilocybin activates our serotonin receptors, and that activation is occurring along that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And just by their names, we can tell that these axes overlap with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So in the brain, they overlap. And so it's not a stretch to assume that one impacts the other. And we already know this from just general experiences and scientific research that so when we're stressed out, that can impact our periods. And if we get our period, that can certainly make us more stressed at times, especially if we've got endometriosis, right? And so we can tell that these axes overlap. And so it's not a stretch to also think that psilocybin likely impacts the menstrual cycle, and the menstrual cycle could potentially even impact a trip, and so there's some research to suggest that where we are in our menstrual cycles matters for when we use psilocybin to have the best experience possible. And so I talked to an indigenous wisdom expert. Her name is Michaela De La Mico, and she goes by Mama De La Mico on
love
Instagram.
Her.
She's fabulous. Love her too. She's great. But I brought her in because anytime we talk about psilocybin, it's so important to discuss indigenous wisdom. We think of science as this process of doing things over and over again to reproduce the same results, but that's exactly what indigenous communities have done for thousands of years, or however long they've been using psilocybin. And so we do have a lot of storied research from indigenous communities. And so I asked her about that. And she recommended that doing a macro dose closer to ovulation is better than doing that when you're about to get your period or when you're on your period. In fact, indigenous communities don't allow people to partake in ceremonies if they are on their periods. And so doing that closer to ovulation, you have more energy within your body to support the dose or to support the trip experience. When we're closer to our periods, a lot of the energy resources in our body are being sent to the womb. And what I mean by energy is like how we are metabolizing glucose and insulin and things like that. So the energy that we're gleaning from food and how our cells are producing energy, that's what I'm referring to. And this all makes sense from a scientific perspective too, because as we get into that luteal phase of our cycles, which as we move closer to our periods, we become much more insulin resistant. So meaning that our bodies are sending all of that, the glucose towards our womb, essentially. And so this can really, really be important for when we actually choose to do a journey. The other thing to consider is that when we are journeying, a lot of people will fast a little bit before a journey. So that might be just a few hours before, or it might be the days leading up there where you're eating differently or completely abstaining from eating. And that is a very difficult thing to do as you're getting towards your period, because that insulin resistance is going to drive cravings. And that's why we have cravings for things when we're getting closer to our periods. And we have more energy available to us in our bodies when we are closer to ovulation. So we can support a fast by doing it that way, if that's something that's part of your psilocybin practice. The other thing that Michaela shared with me is that if you're microdosing for your menstrual cycle, like if you're planning to see how does microdosing affect my menstrual cycle, which many people are doing, to practice whatever microdosing protocol that you're going to follow. There are many out there, and I list two of the most common ones are the Fadiman protocol and the Stamets stack. I list the logistics of that in the book, but follow whatever protocol you're going to follow for about 3 months to see how it affects your cycle. Maybe track your symptoms in a journal. Of Like Minds has a really incredible microdosing journal if you are looking for one. And so just wanted to throw that out there. But yes, tracking how you're feeling over 3 months, because it's going to take 3 months to really see some of those results. I mean, they may happen right away, but if you're not seeing that, you certainly want to keep going for about 3 months with your protocol and keeping an eye on menstrual cycle symptoms.
That was very informative.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much today from you, and it was really just a pleasure, honestly. So please come back anytime. And before we
I'd
end,
love to.
Good. Sorry, I keep cutting you off. So before,
No, you're fine.
Tell us where people can find you and how they can support you.
Absolutely. So you can get the book anywhere books are sold. I always encourage supporting your local independent bookstore, especially if it's woman or non-binary owned.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is you can find me on Instagram or any of the social media platforms. My handle is at Jen Chesak. So that's at JenChesak. And I'm always open to receiving DMs if people have questions. And then I also have a website. Thank you. I also have a website, jenniferchesak.com, that lists all my events. I've been crisscrossing the country doing book events and talks and things like that. So if you want to host me for an event or you just are looking for events to attend, please check that out.
Awesome. I love that. And I'll put the links for all of that in the notes. So
thank you.
This episode was produced by Your Highness Media. Audio editing done by James Crash and sponsored by mitragaya.com. Be sure to subscribe and rate our podcast if you haven't yet. And subscribe to our Your Highness Media newsletter on Substack for everything new going on in the Your Highness Media world.